Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me for today's devotion. We're making our way through the book of Daniel, and today we are in chapter 5. And as always, I encourage you to read the chapter ahead of time, write in your journal what God teaches you, how He speaks to you, either to encourage you or maybe challenge you, grow you, and then watch the video or listen to the podcast. In this chapter, the Babylonian king Belshazzar has he throws a feast, a party, and he has officials bring some of the utensils that they had taken from the temple in Jerusalem when they had ransacked the temple and destroyed it, and they drink wine from those utensils. In other words, really blaspheming the instruments of God from the temple. And suddenly a hand appears and writes on the wall, and no one's able to read or interpret the writing on the wall. And eventually Daniel is brought before Belshazzar, and he interprets it. Now, a little bit of background to help you as you're reading this chapter. Belshazzar and Nabonidus was his father, and he was the successor to Nebuchadnezzar, who had been king when Jerusalem was conquered in 587 BC. Nabonidus kind of went crazy and spent 10 years away from Babylon, and in his absence, Belshazzar, his son, ruled. They were really co-regents, okay? Both of them were rulers. When Nabonidus showed back up, he was the main guy, but they were co-regents. And so Belshazzar is the acting king in Babylon when all of this happens. And Daniel interprets the writing on the wall and says what it means is that you have been judged and that the days of your kingdom, the days of Babylon, are numbered. And down there in verses 25 through 28, he says, and your kingdom will be divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. In other words, your time as king and the time for Babylon to be an empire is over. And it did fall. In fact, we know from history that Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians without any resistance. The people so hated these kings, Nabonidus and Belshazzar, that they didn't even put up a fight, no resistance. They just, the Persians and the Medes just walked in and captured the city, and Babylon fell. So that's a little bit of a historical background. Now, what struck my attention, though, was in verse 18. Look at verse 18 in Daniel 5. Daniel says, O king, now he's talking to Belshazzar about what's just happened. And he says, O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was not his direct father. He was three great kings in the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, and Belshazzar. There were a couple of insignificant kings who only ruled briefly in between, but the kings referred to the ones before them as their father and so on. And so what Daniel is saying here is that God is the one who gave this empire to Nebuchadnezzar. Look at it again in verse 18. The Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, the king that conquered Jerusalem. Now, drop down three kings, the time of Belshazzar, God has judged you, your days are numbered, and you're going to lose the kingdom. Babylon's going to fall. Jeremiah was a prophet in Jerusalem, and I've mentioned this previously, during the same time as essentially Ezekiel was a prophet with the captives over in Babylon, and Daniel was a prophet in Babylon with the captives. Jeremiah was a prophet in Jerusalem leading up to the fall of Jerusalem, and then shortly thereafter, during the 70 years of captivity, you had Ezekiel and Daniel over there in Babylon. It's interesting, though, because here Daniel says God granted Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, all this glory and all this power and all this success. Jeremiah, preaching in Jerusalem, and Jeremiah 27, verse 6, if you want to look it up sometime, chapter 27, verse 6 of Jeremiah, Jeremiah referred to Nebuchadnezzar as God's servant. God's servant. And in verse 7 of chapter 27, Jeremiah said this. He said, all nations shall serve him, Nebuchadnezzar, and his son and his grandson. These three great kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, and Belshazzar, until the time of his own land comes. And then many nations and great kings will make him their servant. So Jeremiah said there's going to be these three great kings in Babylon, and then it's over. Same thing Daniel is saying. The prophecy came true. But Jeremiah said even though Nebuchadnezzar was a pagan king who did not always worship the God of Israel, he was a pagan king, he was God's servant, God's instrument to judge Jerusalem, to judge the southern kingdom of Judah. Daniel said the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, all this glory and so on. Here's the point. God can use evil people to do good things. We sometimes mistakenly think that the only people God can ever use are those who love him. God does use those of us who love him. But if God wants to, God can use anybody and anything. And here's an example of God using a wicked king to discipline, to judge, to punish his own people for a period of time because of their sins. Now, those rulers will eventually be judged, and they were. I remember in 2016, during the presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, I preached a series of sermons from the minor prophets in the Old Testament, one sermon on each of the minor prophets. And one of the things I said a couple of times in that sermon series leading up to that election was that, because nobody was really excited at the time about either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And one of the things I said was, maybe God is giving us what we deserve because there's not a great choice either way at the time. That's what we were saying. And so maybe God's giving us what we deserve. I still believe that. God can use people who don't love him, but eventually they're going to be judged. This Babylonian king Belshazzar offered wealth, reward to anybody who could interpret the writing on the wall. And so he offered it to Daniel. But in verse 17, Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself or give them to someone else. I'm going to do what God's calling me to do. I don't want your gifts. I don't want your money. I don't want your rewards. I don't want your blessing. And I think there's a warning there for us as the people of God. Even though God can use wicked people, be careful. Don't get in bed with them. Maintain your own integrity and do what is right. Be careful. And by the way, that has historically been wise counsel for preachers and politicians, to be careful about getting in bed with politics, because quite often you end up getting dirty in the process. So be careful. God bless you. I'll see you Monday.